Double murder suicide.
Double murder suicide.
Murder suicide.
Double murder suicide at pro wrestler Chris Benoit's Georgia home.
Know if it's a double murder suicide or it's something more insidious. Maybe it's a triple murder.
Who else was there?
The speculation was like, well, it had to be murder.
Someone at the door, or he said, just a minute, and then went to the door and I heard a scuffle or something. Yeah, I heard something like that.
A high-profile celebrity death like one of the top performers in the world's biggest wrestling promotion is going to draw a lot of attention. This is a story that has been told over and over again, but usually through the highly biased and carefully curated PR-cleared lens of the WWE. This multi-billion-dollar company has a history of clearing up events or people that would represent them in a poor light.
No, definitely not.
Which anyone who's familiar with the WWE will know means that everything they released has been polished to fit the push narrative and values of the company. The Benoit tragedy is one of the most talked about events in wrestling history, but some wrestling fans hardly give thought to the extreme mishandling of the investigation that gave it its infamy. If anyone watching is unfamiliar with the case or with the subjects as a whole, here's a brief crash course. Otherwise, you can take a look at our previous video. Chris Benoit was a Canadian technical wrestler who worked under many promotions, including ECW and WCW, but as of the time of his death in 2007, he was one of the biggest stars of the WWE. He had a raw and technical wrestling style, which was something that the promotion had been lacking since their shift back toward more gimmicky performers in the early 2000s. The difference in his style, his character, and his undeniable skill made him popular, and especially popular with the snarky older crowd. On June 25, 2007, a questionably composed wellness check in Fayette County, Georgia, where Chris had been living with his family at the time of their deaths, led to police finding the bodies of Chris himself, along with his wife, Nancy, and his 7-year-old son, Daniel. It was quickly determined by police that the scene they had found was indicative of a murder-suicide, so it's what was told to reporters. These reporters took what little information they had, plastered it anywhere they could to capitalize on a massive story.
We're now looking at this case and ruling it as a double murder suicide involving WWE wrestler Chris Benoit.
And then it was gone. But evidently, the police really lost their handle on this investigation and maybe had no intentions of carrying out a truthful, in-depth investigation in the first place. Even a quick glance at the reports raises an eyebrow. It seems unfinished or almost too underexplained to be published investigation of an incredibly high-profile crime scene. Something is not quite right here, so we conducted some of our own research. Before we get to the scene, let's piece together what had happened in the days before. One of the neighbors of the Benoit family was Holly Schrepfer, who was personable and close with them and knew their schedules. She gave 2 different reports through the case, one verbal followed by one written. In her verbal statement, she explained the Friday morning before the murders. On Friday, June 22nd at 8:30 a.m., Holly saw Chris drop Daniel off at a horse riding camp, which he frequently visited during the week and was next to Holly's home. She said that Chris was driving erratically up the driveway to drop off Daniel. However, her written statement is slightly different. Rather than driving recklessly up the driveway to drop off Daniel, Holly wrote that Chris stopped at the end of the driveway. While this is a small detail, it may give some insight into how trustworthy Schrepfer's statements are. Later on Friday the 22nd, the Benoit family held a cookout at their home. Receipts for a grocery run at Publix from the 22nd were later found at the scene. One of the most significant alleged events comes from a statement made by fellow wrestler and good friend of Chris, Chavo Guerrero. He stated in WWE magazine that he had been speaking to Chris on the phone Friday night, and after about 45 minutes, Chris said that there was someone knocking on his door. He said that he heard some kind of a scuffle before the line from Chris's end went dead, although there is no concrete evidence of this phone call or article. On Saturday the 23rd, the day after the cookout, Chris told Chavo over the phone that the family had gotten sick with food poisoning. An internet search was made on Saturday at about 4 p.m. All it said was Elijah. There are 2 theories surrounding this search. One, that the intention was to find Elijah the Prophet, and the other that it was to find Elijah Burke, who was the last person to wrestle Chris before his death. This will become important as we dive into the scene of the crime. All afternoon, Chris is speaking on the phone with the neighbor Holly and with Chavo. He tells Holly that Daniel and Nancy had food poisoning, so Daniel won't be coming to the camp, and he tells Chavo that he overslept and missed his flight for an event. Holly stated that it was out of the ordinary for Chris to call her. It was not uncommon for him to call Chavo, however. Chavo said that Chris sounded groggy over the phone.
Call right back. Hey, Chavo. Hey, what's up, man? He sounds just off.
A text from Nancy to Chris was sent around 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, June 24th, and appeared to have been written by Nancy. However, it didn't show up as a received message on Chris's phone. More on this shortly. Later on Sunday morning, Chris would text Chavo and Scott Armstrong, a referee, stating Chris's home address. It appeared to be instructions for coming to the house, and said that the dogs would be in the enclosed pool area and the garage side door would be open. The same messages were sent from Nancy's phone. Thinking that the messages along with Chris's behavior and claim that his family was sick were concerning, Chavo and Scott reported them to WWE representatives, who would then call for a welfare check on the family. At about 2:30 p.m. on Monday, June 25th, 2007, Officer Donna Mundy responded to a call for a welfare check on Chris's residence, 130 Green Meadow Lane. Mundy reported being unable to enter the property because the dogs were loose, although the text had said that they would be locked up. But what makes this concerning is that the officers didn't properly enter the house. In fact, rather than calling for a canine handling unit or backup, they instead asked Holly Schrepfer, the neighbor, to enter first and contain the dogs. This not only endangers an outside party, but it also contaminates the scene. This would be the catalyst for an incredibly shoddy investigation. The police report stated that Holly went inside the home, ran upstairs to look for Daniel, and came back out after having discovered his body. Here is everything that they found inside. Nancy, having reportedly been killed before Daniel and Chris, was found in an upstairs room next to a pillow and a Bible. Her hands had been bound together and then around her throat with a coaxial cord, and her feet were bound together with black tape, which was found at the home. Investigators theorized that, based on the level of decomposition, Nancy must have died on Friday the 22nd. But something they didn't take into account was that the room she was in was incredibly warm at 82 degrees, which could have led to a faster decomposition and indicated that she may have died later. Daniel was found in his room lying in a sleeping position in his bed. His room was cooler than the first, but still warm enough to speed up the process of decomposition at 72 degrees. He was not bound, but he was found with another Bible, a children's Bible, propped against his hand. One of the strangest details about Daniel was an alleged needle mark on his arm, which was put into the police report. However, it was later determined by a report from Nancy's sister that this was untrue, and why it was reported originally is unclear and suspicious. Chris's body was found in the basement on one of the weight machines. Within the case reports, the officers stated that Benoit was upright when he was found, but in a later case summary, they stated that he was hanging. It's possible that this was just a differing opinion as to how he was positioned, although it is far from the only discrepancy between all of the reports. He was found with small traces of dried blood on his nose and finger, but according to the case files, investigators were unable to collect any of the dried blood to test for DNA. The reason why? A lieutenant made the decision to transport the bodies prior to collecting samples of the suspected dried blood. But once the body got to the lab, the dried blood had disappeared, which seems like a very strange decision and detail. During the examination, the doctor found a few more questionable things. During an examination of Chris Benoit's body, Dr. Eisenstadt notes slight abrasion on both of Chris Benoit's legs, left foot, left arm and hand, and right hand. Dr. Eisenstadt described a loop black hole from the weight machine located around Chris Benoit's neck, as well as a torn white towel that was wrapped around Chris Benoit's neck and taped together. Did someone tape it together, or did he do it by himself? But why would a person committing suicide care to put a towel around their neck to protect themselves from a bruise? And why was this not reported before? Let's keep going. A final Bible was found in a box with Chris's belongings that was sent to his first wife, which contained a suicide note in Chris's handwriting. The note said, "I am preparing to leave this earth." While this may seem cut and dry, especially after the extreme mishandling of the reports, there are many other strange and suspicious things about the reports from the crime scene. Empty cases of beer and wine were found in the trash at the home, but a toxicology report stated that neither Chris nor Nancy had alcohol in their system at the time of their death. However, the Publix receipts that were found confirmed that Nancy had purchased the alcohol along with the food for the cookout in the days prior. Unfortunately, no DNA testing was done on the beer cans or wine bottles, despite them being empty. If not Nancy and Chris who drank it, why didn't they test it? There were also steroids and painkillers found in the home which weren't found in Chris's system, but receipts for these prescriptions collected by Nancy were in the home. There was a bloody sock taped with hair stuck to it that was determined to be a makeshift gag found in the kitchen trash can. It was tested for DNA and confirmed that it had been used on Nancy, but it did not have Chris's DNA on it. In the reports, it was stated that detectives had found a black-handled knife underneath Daniel's bed on the day they had discovered the bodies, which was Monday. It was unused and clean when taken in for processing, but still strange. A later report said that investigators returned to the scene a week later on Tuesday, July 3rd, and that was the day they had collected the knife. This seems like a very odd piece of evidence to leave behind if it was found and processed on Monday, but even stranger if it truly wasn't found until a week later. This leaves time for it to be tampered with, along with many other mishandled pieces of evidence. Lastly, detectives went to Wachovia Bank to retrieve Nancy Benoit's safety deposit box with a search warrant. They took the entire plastic container and its contents from the bank to their office. And what was found were pictures of Nancy seemingly with injuries to her face. But however, the detectives determined this wasn't from Chris, but from a previous relationship. After the initial scene, the extended investigation somehow left even more questions unanswered. Schrepfer, the neighbor, was a reasonably important part of the Benoit's personal lives. She reported that she was close with the family, particularly with Nancy. She said that Nancy often confided in her while she and Chris fought, including specific details about the family's habits and fights, which does paint a picture of familiarity. As you might recall, when Holly first entered the home, the police report stated that she had gone straight to Daniel's room and only found his body. However, in her written report about the case, she states that she had found both Daniel and Nancy. Though the original police report indicates that she said she only found Daniel, it seems unlikely that if she had seen Nancy as well, she would forget to say so. Others were questioned on Nancy's behalf, namely a friend named Pam Clark and Nancy's sister Sandra Toffolini. Both women reported that Chris and Nancy fought often, but around the time of the murders they had been fighting about money, insurance, specifically life insurance, and the integrity of their relationship. Nancy was reported to have been afraid that Chris was cheating on her with one of the female performers at WWE, citing a second cell phone, a burner phone, which interestingly was found at the crime scene. Why were some things left untouched? Why were things forgotten about accidentally or purposefully? Mistakes and missed evidence like this led to a shoddy, unreliable report because so many things went unanswered and more details only led to more confusion while many theories are attempting to make sense of the case. Oftentimes, the internet is the first to hear about anything that happens, so their opinions and guesses become the first ones shared. One such theory originating from the internet involves Nancy's ex-husband and retired wrestler, Kevin Sullivan.
Kevin, doesn't life suck?
This is not the horrible act that's gonna happen.
I might be coming home, and I might not be.
I'll slap anybody that gets in my face that I am gonna do something horrible.
Kevin Sullivan was a considerably noteworthy performer in WCW. He was often involved with creative decisions and is currently consulted for his takes on current wrestling affairs. But in his prime performing days in the ring, he played a satanic character called the Prince of Darkness. While a wrestler's character is obviously separate from themselves outside of the ring, there are still odd cases of life imitating art, which gives a bit of depth to the conspiracy of Kevin Sullivan's involvement. Kevin and Nancy were married in real life and also part of the Dungeon of Doom faction where they played the roles of Prince of Darkness and Fallen Angel. As mentioned earlier, Kevin influenced the creative department and was therefore partially responsible for a written romantic angle that involved his wife becoming involved with Chris Benoit, who was The conspiracy that Kevin was responsible for the Benoit family's deaths weighs on two major points. Kevin had a rough past with Chris, and the murders took place approximately on the 10th anniversary of Kevin and Nancy's divorce. Kevin was an alleged Satanist, and coincidentally, there are many religious themes throughout the case. This was one of the first shared conspiracies behind the tragedy, and it seems that the most predominantly this idea was suggested and pushed by Johnny Lee Clary. Clary isn't exactly the most trustworthy source, having not given his own sources for his claims, but the idea still gained traction. If believing that Sullivan was the one responsible, it would be built on a couple of key points. Chavo had said that while on the phone with Chris, he told him there was a knock on the door and there was an audible scuffle afterwards. This could suggest that whoever was responsible, be it Kevin or someone hired by Kevin, entered the home then. If it was someone that the family knew, then that could explain why they were able to enter the home by knocking on the door. First, there were no signs of forced entry based on the investigation, so whoever was responsible for the murders in this theory would be a welcome guest, or at least a familiar one, or had help from a familiar one. And remember, the dogs were supposed to be locked up in the enclosed pool area, but were suddenly let out loose. Next, some of the unanswered and suspicious questions like the empty beer cans and empty wine bottle in the trash. The weird thing is, alcohol didn't come up in the family's autopsy. The only trace of alcohol that was found was in Nancy's body due to decomposition. Also, the Bibles at the scene could be tied back to another person being at the home at the time of the murders, in this case suggesting it would have been Kevin Sullivan. There were also no bruises on the family or other signs of a struggle or a fight. In this kind of case, the perpetrators could have drugged or held the victims at gunpoint. As mentioned earlier, painkillers and anxiety medication, all prescriptions picked up by Nancy were found in the systems of herself and Chris. This could have been what was used to sedate them. According to the scene summaries, Nancy and Daniel were killed first and Chris died last. In this theory, the last phone call to Chavo where Chris states that he loved him in a strange and groggy tone would have been the final goodbye message before Chris himself was killed. Alternatively, there's another theory suggesting that the reported time of death was inaccurate. The temperatures in Nancy and Daniel's rooms were unusually warm, implying that the bodies may have decomposed at a faster rate than usual. This could potentially mean that the Benoit family passed away simultaneously or closer in time than initially thought. Afterward, the strange text from Chris and Nancy's phone stating their address would be sent by the killers to lead them to the scene. Finally, these strange searches on the computer for Elijah. The last page found on Chris Benoit's computer was the prophet Elijah. The prophet Elijah's story explains that he resurrected the son of a widow by pleading to God for his soul to return to his body, in order to give the widow faith in God. Perhaps this, along with the Bibles, was a sick way to mock God? While this theory gives the story a motivation and the play-by-play of an elaborate true crime murder, it is still nothing more than a theory.
That's a fallacy about those Haitians. That's not true.
Kevin himself responded to the claims, saying in short that he thought the accusations were absurd and that the public had bought too much into his Satanism gimmick. He even stated that he was a devoted Catholic. Still, large accusations or not, jealousy and revenge are incredibly common motivations for extreme actions, especially on a theory that Kevin Sullivan had anything to do with this tragedy is mere speculation.
But now comes this mysterious Wikipedia posting at midnight on Sunday.
A man named Matthew Greenberg, someone who has since been labeled a Wikipedia hacker by Concussion Inc., updated the Wikipedia page about Nancy Benoit's death a full 14 hours before the crime had been made public. When the IP address of the poster was traced, it led to Greenberg, who lived only a minute away from the WWE headquarters in Connecticut. There isn't a lot known about Greenberg or why he had this information so quickly, so the suspicion behind this update remains. On June 29th, investigators received a fax from WWE with a chat log from the 24th. At about 8 p.m., a user by the name of Gob the Illusionist sent a message stating that Chris Benoit's wife had died. Other users in the chat room theorized that Chris was responsible. And remember, all of these messages were sent the day before the public had been made aware of the family's deaths. The theory raises a lot of questions. How did these users have this information, and why were they so adamant that Chris killed her? If my favorite athlete missed a game because their wife was sick, I don't think I would jump to the conclusion of murder. But there are still so many unanswered questions. Who is Matthew Greenberg, and did he have some involvement with the WWE? Why would this post be made before the public had been made aware of the deaths? What would the motivation be if the WWE had somehow been responsible for them? Overall, this is once again nothing but a theory made in an attempt to explain a terrible thing with no definite answers. Since news broke about Chris Benoit's death, the public has not been shy about what they think about it. Aside from the theories that Chris wasn't the one responsible, there is still a lot to be said and discussed about the state of his health when he died. What is certain is that the family died over that weekend, and the investigation wasn't carried out 100% thoroughly. The autopsy, however, did prove to be extremely important in the case and brought up things about wrestling that aren't often talked about for public relation reasons above all else. The autopsy showed that Chris had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is a brain condition that develops after repeated head injuries, like the ones collected by wrestlers throughout their careers. Based on what Nancy's friends and sister reported, Nancy said that Chris displayed a lot of the symptoms of CTE within the year of his death. Older text messages from Nancy to Chris in May of 2007 give some insight to what their life and relationship was like at the time. One stated that Nancy was tired of Chris's recent behavior and that he was passive-aggressive and abusive. This could be an indicator that his condition was developing or worsening and that it was affecting how he was treating his wife. One of the most telling symptoms of CTE is aggression and loss of impulse control, something Nancy reported he had been displaying. Another one of the common symptoms is confusion or delusion, which heightens the anxiety and suicidality too. Nancy's sister Sandra said that Chris would take tons of different routes to places he went to frequently, like the gym and the airport, out of fear of being followed. With the state of his degenerative brain condition, Chris could have experienced a bout of uncontrollable anger followed by some kind of religious psychosis or delusion. Sandra also said that she believes Chris totally blacked out and when he realized what he'd done, went out of his mind. When considering all of the stressful factors leading up to the tragedy of the murders, like Chris's mental health, the state of his marriage, the recent deaths of his friends such as Eddie Guerrero, and so on, the reality of what must have happened becomes more clear. But there are still these theories of cover-ups and conspiracies regardless of what the truth is. If accepted as fact, Chris Benoit being responsible for the deaths of his family creates a narrative of wrestling being unsafe and more specifically that WWE does not take proper care of their performers. If CTE is the ultimate deciding factor in the case, it suggests that the deaths were caused by untreated brain injuries that came as the result of working within the WWE. The company does not want to hold any responsibility for the tragedy. It could explain why their response was so strange, to paint Benoit as evil, as unmentionable, scrubbing him from everything that they could, even though it is far more likely that Benoit was severely damaged and unhealthy than he was evil. Despite the feeling that everyone has their own definitive answer as to what happened, there are still many things that haven't been answered. Like, why some of the evidence was never tested for DNA? What happened on the phone call with Chavo? Why Matthew Greenberg knew about Nancy's death? Who assaulted Nancy in those photos? One of the most important takeaways from this case will be remembering to question narratives and think critically about information. Official reports, ones that should be the most trustworthy sources, were inconsistent, incomplete, and generally suspicious in this case. Thinking about and discussing tragic stories can reap rewards and further investigations, but it's also important to remember that these are real people. So with that said, engage, discuss, think about it, but let's keep it nice and friendly, or I'll steal your shoes. Also remember to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications on, and interact with those polls so we know what to do. Thank you for watching.